Thank you, Eileen. Looks like I got here just in the nick of time. And thank you all for coming this evening. For those of you who heard my presentation about Vicksburg last time, a couple, 3 weeks ago, you heard me explain that I agree with many historians that think that perhaps Vicksburg is the more important battle strategically in the history of the Civil War. But I have been constantly reminded over the last few days as this flood of information coming out of the media that as far as the American public is concerned, Gettysburg is the battle to be paying attention to. And I've been thinking about why that might be the case, and there's plenty of very good reasons. There's no question that it is one of the turning points of the war. And that, coupled with Vicksburg, in my mind, plus the Emancipation Proclamation, those are the main turning points of the war. But it's also easily the largest battle in terms of those who are engaged, and especially in terms of the casualties involved. 3-day battle, all 3 days, very bloody, gruesome fighting that was going on. And it also has the distinction of being in the Eastern Theater. In other words, close to most of the newspapers of the day. So it got a lot of publicity because of that reason. And I think another big reason is that it was where a couple of the most prominent Confederate leaders served, and in the top of that list is Robert E. Lee. And that gets me to, I guess, thinking about more literary terms, and I don't know if this will work for you or not, but it makes some sense to me. There's something very tragic about this battle in some respects. Now, if you take the Union perspective, which most of us do, you think that's absolutely not the case. But there is this whole notion of the great lost cause, the glorious lost cause, and much of the Civil War history, the military history, has been written by Southerners. And so they look at this battle and try to figure out, how did we lose it? This is the place that we lost it. So it takes on the role of Greek tragedy, and I think that's in large part why Americans embrace this battle and are so fascinated by this battle even to this day. But you didn't come here to hear me talk about that, so let's move on here quickly. And we have to start with a refresher of what happened just a couple months before, in May of 1863. Of course, right at the beginning of that month is this major, incredible victory that the Confederates had, led by Robert E. Lee, at Chancellorsville, just a few miles west of Fredericksburg, where they had also beaten the Union forces. In this case, it was Joseph Hooker who they beat. The telling moment of the whole battle was when Stonewall Jackson, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, did that huge left flanking movement and caught Oliver Howard's 11th Corps by surprise, and just rolled that corps on up. And after that, the Union forces were basically reacting and on their heels, and it just didn't turn out well. The problem with that battle, as far as the Confederates were concerned, was the casualties that they had. 1,700 killed, over 13,000, almost 13,500 casualties altogether. A lot of those people the Confederates are not going to be able to replace. And right at the top of that list is Stonewall Jackson, who was killed. He died a few days after the battle. The Union, coming out of that battle, had their own problems. In that case, they had 2-year regiments that had enlisted, instead of the 3-year norm, 2-year regiments, and a bunch of 9-month regiments. And a lot of these folks are now going to be getting out of the Union Army somewhere in May, June, July, into August timeframe. So there's a real imperative as far as Hooker's concerned to get this army fighting. That's one of the main reasons he fought when he did at Chancellorsville. If we look at what was going on in the West, it's an entirely different picture for the Confederacy. And of course, that's what we talked about so much last time at Vicksburg. The war was just not going well. There was several months early in 1863 that the Confederates thought that they were getting the better of Grant. But he was nothing but persistent, and by the time you get to late April, he's already south of Vicksburg, moving north towards the siege that would eventually lead to the the surrender of the garrison at Vicksburg. Bragg is versus Rocrans in Tennessee, and that's, at this time in the war, that's basically a stalemate. But Bragg was, although he is a favorite of Jefferson Davis, he was certainly not in the same level as Robert E. Lee or some of the commanders in the East. And here's the bottom line for the Confederates. They've got a shrinking pool of manpower to play into. Now, politics always plays into warfare more than we'd like to admit, and that's certainly the case after Chancellorsville. This was an incredible defeat for Hooker. Part of that defeat can be explained because he got injured early in the campaign and got a concussion. But it wasn't so severe that it took him out of the battle. So he was foggy for much of the battle and didn't perform well. But regardless, he came out of it and he blamed three other commanders, corps commanders, for what was going on. A couple of them are up here. Near the top of the list was Oliver Howard, the commander of the 11th Corps that got rolled up by Jackson's forces. Another one was Sedgwick, who was the commander of a corps, 6th Corps, in Fredericksburg. And Hooker had given him a lot of responsibility, and it just didn't seem that Sedgwick was up to the task to act independently. That was the assumption that Hooker had given him. You've got to act independently. So Sedgwick took some of the blame. Although most of the Union didn't recognize it at the time, he was deserving that blame. And then General Stoneman, who was the commander of the cavalry, was absolutely not aggressive enough when he went on a major raid towards Richmond, but basically to cut the Confederate railroad lines and to burn the bridges over the rivers. That never happened. So those were the three people that Hooker is glad to blame for this. And May 13th, though, Hooker writes to Lincoln that he hopes to commence his campaign the next day. And here's Lincoln's response. I must tell you that I have some painful intimations that some of your corps and division commanders are not giving you their entire confidence. This would be ruinous if true. Now, if ever there was a person who was deserving to have general officers talking behind their back, Hooker's your man, because he had no qualms about talking about Burnside in very explicit terms. But I'm sure this took him somewhat by surprise and was very disturbing to him. And in fact, it was true. General Halleck, the general-in-chief, had talked to several of these commanders on May 7th, a few days before this, and three of them came up and were basically actively advocating that Hooker be replaced. General Slocum was leading that course, and also in that group is General Darius Couch and General Sedgwick. Those three were actively looking to try to replace Hooker, and generally with General Meade, who really didn't want to have anything to do with it. He wasn't interested in having his name thrust forward like that. Reynolds and Howard, 1st Corps commander and the 11th Corps commander, were also somewhat on the fence, but they would have certainly been willing to go along with the notion that it was time for Hooker to step down. So all of that is going on at this time, at the very time that Hooker's trying to convince Halleck and Lincoln that he needs to go on the offensive. Lee's strategy then, coming out of Chancellorsville, what does he want to accomplish? Well, the first thing is he's going to look at what he wants to do with his army and where he does not want to fight his army. On May 13th, he and Longstreet kind of brainstormed some of this out, and by that time already, Lee was talking about going north. They knew at that time that Vicksburg was a big problem. It looked like the siege was going to be inevitable. In fact, the siege starts on the 18th of May, and that if the siege was inevitable, it was inevitable that Vicksburg would eventually fall. So part of the rationale was we need to do something to kind of counterbalance this impending disaster we're going to have in the West. He had a low regard for Hooker. He liked the idea of going north and living off the fat of the northern land. Maryland was good in that respect when he went during the Antietam campaign. He thought Pennsylvania would be even better in that respect. He doesn't want to fight south of the Rappahannock River. His army was essentially starving for lack of supplies there. Better to go north and do that. So he seeks to have battle on the South's terms. There is still this notion, although I don't think it's realistic at this time, that doesn't mean that they didn't hope for it, that they could get either England or France to recognize the nation, especially if they had success in this battle up north. So what is his objective, Lee's objective? Northern morale and peace Democrats. And let me just read one quote here, Robert E. Lee, and when he's writing to his wife. If successful this year, next fall, there will be a great change in public opinion at the North. The Republicans will be destroyed, and I think the Friends of Peace will become so strong that the next administration will go in on that basis. In other words, it's a long-range objective, but if Lee can sustain a decisive victory in the North, that would be great encouragement for those who are advocating for peace in the North, the peace Democrats. And by 1864, we know that George McClellan is going to be their candidate. The other objective, then, is a decisive victory. And this is always in the mind of the ever-aggressive, audacious Robert E. Lee, to thump him to the point where they'll be begging for peace. And here's a perfect example of his mindset. Robert E. Lee it was not in his makeup to back off and let the enemy have the initiative and let the enemy take the offensive. Here's what he said. Oftentimes, he that played a very bold game, but it was the only possible one. Now, we're going to hear much more about what Longstreet has to say about this campaign in a few slides here. Here's the Army of Northern Virginia. Before this campaign, there were 2 corps. And you notice all these corps are over 20,000 men. These are much larger than the Union Corps, and we'll see that in a few slides. But Lee has to reorganize because one of his corps commanders, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, had just been killed in the last battle. So he still has James Longstreet, the old warhorse. Longstreet is a West Point officer, 54th out of 56th in the class of 1842. But you find out when you study military history that doesn't necessarily mean there'll be a failure once they get to the battlefield. And Longstreet was Lee's closest, most trusted advisor by this time. Originally from South Carolina, he'd served in the Mexican War, as almost all of these people had, and he was the perfect foil to what Lee had, who could take initiative on the battlefield and make things happen and move things forward. But, as we're going to see later on, by this time already he's starting to really work on Lee and trying to convince him, go on the strategic offensive, but once you get to the battlefield you like, go on the tactical defensive. Hunker down and let the enemy attack you on your choice of a battlefield. The Second Corps, 2 corps, Lieutenant General Richard Ewell with 3 divisions. They had to do some shuffling around with these divisions. He was known, this won't surprise you, what would you have for a nickname for that gentleman? Old Baldy. That's his nickname. 1840 West Point graduate, near the top of his class. Served with Phil Kearney in the Oregon and Santa Fe trails. Was a veteran serving under Winfield Scott in the Mexican War. Was involved with the Valley campaigns. In other words, he's one of Jackson's proteges. And after the Battle of Second Bull Run, he got hit in the leg and his leg was amputated. So he's sitting out Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, but now he's ready to come back to command, and he gets the Second Corps. The Third Corps goes to Ambrose Powell Hill. They normally refer to him as Powell Hill. We know him as A.P. Hill. He comes from Virginia. He started in the class of 1847. He graduated in that class. He started in 1842. He was a classmate to begin with George McClellan and Stoneman and Pickett and Darius Couch, the names you're going to hear tonight. He didn't stay in that class, though, because he got gonorrhea and was kicked out for a year and came back and finished up a year later. Now, here's one of the amazing parts of the Civil War. You study these people and the personalities really come out. His roommate for that first year at the academy was none other than George McClellan. In fact, he was engaged to this woman who eventually ended up marrying George McClellan. So it's a small army back in those days. And it tells you something about, imagine this also, what you know and what you remember about Stonewall Jackson, an incredibly pious religious man. How do you suppose Stonewall Jackson and A.P. Hill got along? Not well at all. And Stonewall Jackson had a way of taking some very general orders that gave him a lot of flexibility that he received from Robert E. Lee and giving very specific pointed orders to his subordinates. And top of that list are Richard Ewell and A.P. Hill. So these are gentlemen who are used to getting very specific orders where there's no question exactly what they're supposed to do. And that's important as we go down the road here. Okay, Brandy Station. As the Army now is moving north, just to begin, right before they do begin to move north, Jeb Stuart decides that he wants to have a grand ball. You know, this flashing, debonair cavalry officer loves to impress the ladies, certainly loved to impress the ladies of Northern Virginia, so he puts on this incredibly lavish grand ball on June 4th, and the next day he has his entire cavalry corps participate in a parade, a grand review. So he's got 5 brigades, 6 artillery batteries, well over 10,000 troopers. They're marching across in front of this large gathering of the citizens of Northern Virginia, and as they start, they do a trot, and then they go into a gallop, and they all go galloping across in front of the reviewing stands, and then they have a mock battle, and all the way to include having artillery fire that's blank rounds as the cavalry is attacking them. So it's a great show, just the kind of thing that Stuart loves. Well, the only problem was Robert E. Lee wasn't there, so June 8th, he does it all over again. And of course, Lee is favorably impressed, everybody's impressed. The only problem was at about the same time, General Pleasanton, who is the commander of the Union cavalry, had taken over from Stoneman since he was obviously a failure, is told to go on a major reconnaissance, a spoiling attack, to figure out where the Confederates are. He crosses the Rappahannock River right through here, and 2 locations. In the north is Buford, and in the south is Gregg. And Buford's division engages Stuart almost immediately, surprises him. But it's a give and take kind of an affair. Certainly the Confederate cavalry had good reason to be proud of their many successes they had had prior to this time. And it's a give and take, but it looks like Stuart's getting the better hand until Gregg's forces come around and get them right here at Brandy Station, and they have to react to that. Now, we could spend a long time talking about some of these engagements, but we're not going to. The important thing in this case is that Stuart is embarrassed. In fact, the newspapers really go after him for being caught flat-footed. And it says he's puffed up cavalry. This is from the Richmond Examiner. The consequences of negligence and bad management. Now, this is one day before Stuart is supposed to screen the rebel army as they head up north, be the right screen of the army. And this is about the same time that Hooker says, okay, we're getting intimations now. The rebels are moving up north. Mr. Lincoln, General Halleck, we want to actually attack Richmond. Let's take Richmond since they're removing the defenses. And here is Lincoln's guidance. And I think you can continue to see Lincoln's role as a military strategist in his own right by this time.
Your long dispatch of today is just received. If left to me, I would not go south of the Rappahannock upon Lee's moving north of it. If you had Richmond invested today, you would not be able to take it in 20 days. Meanwhile, your communications, and with them, your army would be ruined. I think Lee's army, and not Richmond, is your true objective point. If he comes towards the upper Potomac, follow on his flank, and on the inside track, shortening your lines whilst he lengthens his. Fight him when opportunity offers. If he stays where he is, fret him, and fret him.
There's Lincoln. By this time of the war, in fact, he's been very consistent on this point. The objective is the enemy army. It's not cities. It's the enemy's army. And so that's his guidance to Hooker. Now, let's take a quick look at the Confederates moving north. I'm sure you all can make sense of all these arrows going north. It does get a little busy, but stay with me here. You've got Ewell's corps that is leading this movement north. And they're basically going to get through the passes into the Blue Ridge Mountains, into the Shenandoah Valley, and then move north basically with that cover of the Shenandoah Valley. And you can see here's some cavalry. This is the Confederate cavalry here in the screening operation. So you've got Ewell, and then following Ewell is Longstreet's corps, and following Longstreet, right behind Longstreet, is A.P. Hill's corps, all moving north. And of course, as you do so, you're totally uncovering Fredericksburg and leaving Richmond somewhat vulnerable, although Richmond has its own defenses. The first major engagement they get at is right here at Winchester. And the Union commander was instructed to evacuate. He decides not to evacuate, and as a result, Robert Milroy's command is eventually going to be taken captive after putting up some stiff resistance. But that wasn't the point of the whole thing. He was supposed to have gotten out of there. And in the movie, the unit moves north. By June 22nd, oops, sorry about that. By June 22nd, Ewell is in Pennsylvania. And by that time, the Union is quite a ways south of that. Once they get into Pennsylvania, 2 divisions of Ewell's corps head north towards Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and then eventually they're going to head towards Harrisburg. And at least 1 brigade is going to head towards Gettysburg and then continue west to Wrightsville, right here. That's the plan, and that's what they actually did execute. June 25th, okay, June 22nd, the Confederates are here. June 25th, Hooker is just finally crossing the Potomac River. But there's one other thing that we need to know here before we get into the campaign in Pennsylvania itself. And that's this interesting experience that Stuart had. Now remember, last time we were talking about Stuart, he's been embarrassed at Brandy Station. He is Lee's cavalry force. Actually, they had bolstered the force. They had additional brigades that were now added to the cavalry that Lee had to his availability. One was Imboden's brigade of irregulars. We're going to see Morgan's irregulars are going to play in a role here later on, but there's also a William Grumble Jones who comes from the Shenandoah Valley, and a couple other units, smaller units. The whole rub is, though, that initially there's going to be this screening action, as we talked about. And early on in here, we have a series of battles. June 17th and 18th, the Battle of Aldie. This is Union cavalry against Confederate cavalry. June 18th, Battle of Middleburg. And June 21st and 22nd, Battle of Upperville. These are 3 engagements where Stuart is doing what he's supposed to do, preventing the Union cavalry from seeing what's going on behind those mountains. But it's about that time, though, that there's a discussion with what to do next. And I've got to read a couple quotes here. Lee at one time authorizes Stuart to go ahead, because Stuart's really just jumping at the chance to take this end run around the Union Army. He's done it twice before. The last time he did it was after Antietam campaign. He rode entirely around the Union Army. He's done it twice before. He wants to do it again. Is what literally another feather in his cap, so to speak. That's what he wants. Here's Lee's conditional kind of instructions, that he would move but only if he can move into Maryland and take possession of General Ewell's right, guarding his flank, keeping him informed of the enemy's movement, and collect all the supplies you can for the use of the army. In other words, you're supposed to keep pretty close to Ewell and keep Ewell informed so that the Union army is not going to surprise him. But that order goes to Longstreet, and then it goes to Stuart. It gets altered a little bit, and there's some discussion now, and Stuart's still gnawing at the bit to do the run around the Union army. And finally, he gets these instructions from Lee. If you can pass around their army without hindrance, cross the river east of the mountains. Okay, didn't say which mountains. And he gives them enough rope to hang himself. And that's exactly what Stuart is now going to do. So June 25th, he starts this ride. He goes across the Potomac River. He actually raids far enough towards Washington, D.C. that he can see the Capitol Dome. He captures this very substantial wagon train with lots of supplies, a lot of forage, and then he continues north. He gets into a little engagement here in Hanover, right here, runs into some Union cavalry, and instead of going straight west from there, he realizes he's got to head east and then a little north. And so for a long period of time, as far as Lee's concerned, he's blind. Stuart's supposed to be providing reconnaissance and telling him where the enemy is. And Stuart's not telling him anything because, quite frankly, Stuart doesn't know where the Confederate army is. In fact, they find out about some of these things by reading about it in the Baltimore newspaper. So, bit of a problem. The next shoe to drop is going to happen on the Union side. In this movement north, Harper's Ferry is bypassed. Now remember, in the Antietam campaign, they didn't do that. It was actually A.P. Hill's division in the Antietam campaign that took Harper's Ferry and then rushed up to Antietam to save the day. But in this case, they bypassed it. Now, there's a garrison there, and Hooker desperately wants to get the garrison. But General Halleck is being very tight-fisted with giving him control, allowing him control. This continuous feud between the two men is going on, and it's going to make things worse. So, Hooker writes to Halleck, "Is the army to be maneuvered from Washington? Is there any reason Maryland Heights should not be abandoned?" So here's a very pointed message. Hooker wants that army. And Halleck's response, "I cannot approve their abandonment, except in case of absolute necessity." Well, I don't know exactly what's going on in Hooker's mind, but he turns around to General French, who is the commander of the garrison at Harper's Ferry, and orders him to accompany the army to move north. Well, what's General French to do? He's not going to put his rear end that far out there, so he telegraphs Washington, D.C. to Halleck, and Halleck's response, "Pay no attention to General Hooker's orders." Well, as far as Hooker's concerned, this is throwing down the gauntlet. "I beg to be understood respectfully but firmly that I am unable to comply with this condition with the means at my disposal, and earnestly request that I may at once be relieved from the position I occupy." He's asking to be relieved. Probably doesn't really want to be relieved, but he's going to, throw down the gauntlet and see what happens. It takes Lincoln and Halleck very little time to decide that they're going to replace him and put George Meade in his stead. Now again, George Meade was the general officer that everybody else was recommending take the command. I kind of jumped over a couple things. Lincoln and Halleck had actually offered the command to several officers. One of them was Reynolds, another one was Couch, another one was even Hancock, Winfield Scott Hancock. All of them turned it down. Reynolds turned it down at one time because he said, "Well, I'll take it, but only if I know Washington, D.C. is not going to interfere with my command." Well, those were conditions that Halleck wasn't ready to accept. But everybody thought that Meade was the right guy. And so on June 28th, George Gordon Meade takes command. Now think about it. July 1st, we know, if we're jumping up ahead, 150 years ago today is day 2 of the Battle of Gettysburg. July 1st is day 1. This is 3 days, 4 days in front of that. You're taking command of an army that's rapidly on the move north, heading for an engagement. You don't know where the enemy is. Imagine the uncertainty and what's going on in George Meade's mind at that particular point in time. It's incredible to even think about it. Here's the Army of the Potomac. Much more robust, but again, this concern over the 2-year units leaving soon. There's 31 New York regiments and 2 Maine regiments that are 2-year regiments. There's 16,700 9-month regiments, primarily from Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Now, these were ones that were raised when the fear of Antietam was going on. 25 units are scheduled to muster out in June alone. So that's already going on. In the midst of this, this number is being depleted on a daily basis. Looks like a big number, but it's being depleted steadily. And 48,000 fewer troops by July 1st versus May 1st. So, if you're going to have a battle, you want to have it soon, even though you're in the midst of this morale crisis as well as this numerical crisis in the Army. Now, you notice a couple changes here. General Couch, who was commander of the 2nd Corps, had asked to be relieved, and he was given another command. And Winfield Scott Hancock comes in. You've got Dan Sickles still in the 3rd Corps. We'll get to him later. George Sykes takes over command of the 5th Corps. That was Meade's old Corps command. So there's a little bit of maneuvering back and forth, but not quite as much turmoil as the Confederates had to place. And still in place is Sedgwick, who didn't prove quite up to the task as an independent command, but he still had his gumption when it came to being somebody else's subordinate. And then Oliver Howard in the 11th Corps, which was severely diminished because of their experience at Chancellorsville. That corps had a lot to prove. And a couple of these corps, 3rd Corps and Slocum's 7th Corps, are quite a bit smaller. 12th Corps. There is an artillery reserve, but one other thing that the Union did right before this battle was revert to their old artillery organization, and General Henry Hunt, who was a staff officer under George Meade, was the artillery staff officer, and he's going to give a great amount of latitude to control the artillery on the battlefield, and that's going to be important later on. So, the Confederates are into Pennsylvania now. And what are they to do once they get there, other than hopefully Lee finds the conditions for the right kind of battle? Here's his General Order number 72, to live off the land, but prohibit plundering of private property. And when you do so, if you have to seize private property, because after all, that's why they're going north, to get provisions, food supplies, forage for their animal, their livestock, they're going to pay for it. Well, what's the Confederate Army going to pay with? Confederate script. So as long as the Confederates win, it might be okay for you, but I'm sure they didn't think too much of it. Wanted to play one quote here. One of the Confederates, and here's his image of what Lee had ordered that they do.
We have inflicted serious injury upon the corpulent Dutch farmers of that loyal state in the destruction of bee gums, fowls, eggs, butter, cherries, green apples, cider, and apple butter. It will take at least 3 seasons to replenish the stock, besides playing sad havoc with their horses and cattle. Our army will not cost the Confederacy a great deal as long as we remain in Pennsylvania.
So they're liking it. They were almost starving in Virginia. They're living off the fat of the land right now. Now, another thing that the Confederates are doing as they move forward, they're seizing the things that they need, paying for them as they go. When they run across blacks, the question is, are they escaped slaves? Are they freedmen? In most cases, the African Americans are rounded up and shipped back south. So that's something the Union Army obviously wasn't doing. And They also were demanding tribute in many of these towns. Now here is Greencastle. It's one of the first places that they got to as they moved into Pennsylvania. The tribute for Greencastle, I just want to read this quickly. 120 pistols, 100 saddles and bridles, 1,000 pounds of leather, 2,000 pounds of lead, 200 currycombs, 12 boxes of tin, foodstuffs including onions, potatoes, radishes, and sauerkraut. Not sure that's what I'd ask for, but that's what they wanted. When they got to Gettysburg, and it was Jubal Early's division that got to Gettysburg the first time as they're passing through, the tribute was 7,000 pounds of bacon, 1,200 pounds of sugar, 1,000 pounds of salt, 600 pounds of coffee. They always wanted coffee. 600 barrels of flour, 10 barrels of onions, 10 barrels of whiskey, 1,000 pairs of shoes, and 500 hats, or $5,000 in cash. Now, the citizens of Gettysburg didn't really have either one of those. They certainly weren't willing to cough up $5,000. So some of the rebels kind of took some latitude and got the things that they needed, raided some cellars and grabbed some things. But one Gettysburg woman described them that they were all those in and around the streets behaved themselves well. Okay? When they got to York, another one of the brigade commanders, Extra Billy Smith, who was the former governor of Virginia. Well, he didn't just get to town and deliver the tribute demands, but he had to make a speech, being a politician. So here's his speech. My friends, how do you like this way of coming back into the Union? I hope you like it. I have been in favor of it for a good while. But don't misunderstand us. We are not here with any hostile intent, unless the conduct on your side shall render hostilities unavoidable. You see, it was getting a little warm down our way. We needed a summer outing and thought we would take it as at the north instead of patronizing the Virginia Springs as we generally do. So a little bit of humor in the midst of warfare, I guess. York's tribute, 21,000 pounds of bacon, 2,000 shoes, and $100,000 in cash. And again, the citizens of York had nothing close to that they wanted to surrender. Anyway, it's about this same time, though, June 28th, that Lee starts getting very nervous because he still doesn't know where the Union Army is, other than maybe to read some things in the newspaper, and that's not nearly enough. And he says, I cannot hear from General Stuart, the eyes of the army. And this is after a spy, Henry Harrison, an actor and a spy who was a good friend of Longstreet, had reported into Longstreet with a report that he'd seen the Union Army and they were well into Maryland and heading north fast. And that's when you have Lee asking these questions. What do you think of Harrison? And he got the answer that, well, old Pete thinks a good deal of Harrison. So on that alone, Lee feels he has no choice but to consolidate his army. By that time, you've got elements that are up here near Harrisburg, over in Wrightsville, all over this vicinity. He's got to get them together because the last thing he wants to do is to take on the Union Army piecemeal. He needs to have his whole force because he knows that the Union is going to outnumber him. So the command goes out. He wants them to consolidate at Cashtown right here. And at the time, he's over here in Chambersburg. Now, this is where Gettysburg really becomes important because, as we'll see in a map here soon, in this region of Pennsylvania, all roads seem to lead to Gettysburg. Let's take a look at Gettysburg itself. It's not a big city. Remember, we were talking about Vicksburg. Gettysburg is only 2,400 people, so it's a small town. Those days, it probably sounded much larger, but it's a small town. But it's an important crossroads area. Look at all of the roads. Chambersburg Pike here is an important one. Here's the pike from York. Here's the Baltimore Pike. There's also a railroad that's about halfway built, heading towards the Susquehanna River, but here's where it ends. And if you continue this north, there is already a cut. They've already cut through the small hills there, and that's going to be important to the battle later on. There's a Lutheran seminary sitting outside of town somewhere over here on Seminary Ridge. There's also a Pennsylvania college. There's a little bit of industry in town. And let's take a look at some of the other dominant terrain features. Here's McPherson's Ridge. And as you get up here to the top of McPherson's Ridge is Oak Hill. That's a dominant piece of terrain. Then you've got, from McPherson's Ridge, you've got another low-lying ridge here in Seminary Ridge, and then a third. And that's the one that we hear so much about. Actually, Seminary Ridge kind of goes down here, if you will. Here is Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. And as you get down to this part of Cemetery Ridge, it really gets pretty low. There's not much of a ridge line at all. The terrain over here is actually a little bit higher. And then you have Little Round Top and Round Top. You also have Culp's Hill right here. Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, both on the south side of Gettysburg itself. North of the city, you've got some pretty open, low-lying terrain right up here. Now, let's take a couple closer looks. This is the very imposing gatehouse for Evergreen Cemetery, right there in Cemetery Hill. Here is the Lutheran Seminary, which will eventually be an important place both on day one and once the Confederates take it on day two. Here is, gosh, my brain went just dead here. Devil's Den. And Big Round Top and Little Round Top. I should point out, Devil's Den, very close to Little Round Top, Big Round Top. The wheat field, the peach orchard, all very important pieces of terrain as we get into the battle itself. So that's the terrain that they're going to be fighting over for the next 3 days. First contact happens on July 1st in the morning. Lee's intent actually is to kind of let General Heath, it's spelled H-E-T-H, but it's pronounced Heath, to do a little bit of reconning, thinking that you might just run into some local militia when you head towards Gettysburg. But they're feeling out where the enemy is supposed to be. And Heath's instructions are, find where the enemy is, but do not engage in battle. I want to get my army together before we get to that. So instructions, do not engage in combat. Meade's intent, he's in northern Maryland. He's hoping to entice the Confederates down into his terrain. And it doesn't necessarily work out that way, but he gives some latitude to a couple people, primarily to Reynolds, who's going to be the first Corps commander on the scene. He wants to have battle at Pipe Creek, and he's just a few miles south of there. Those are locations that he feels comfortable to have battle with. But Buford is the one who first encounters the Confederates as they're moving eastward from Chambersburg and Cashtown towards Gettysburg itself. At 7:30, a small picket of Buford's soldiers is the first to encounter it, and it's actually the 8th Illinois, a lieutenant by the name of Marcellus Jones, who's out on the picket line, Pickett Station, dismounted soldiers, and they spot in the distance some Confederates. So Buford asks for a carbine. They got Spencer carbines, and uses a fence rail, takes aim at the Confederates, fires one round, and doesn't hit a thing, which is typical for the Civil War era. That's the first round, fired by an Illinois soldier. Heath knows that he's encountered the enemy, still thinks it's probably not much, so he continues to push. And at the same time, Buford deploys his cavalry along McPherson's Ridge. He tells them to dismount. There are a certain percentage of the cavalrymen who are always behind the front lines holding the horses, while the dismounted cavalry go forward and get in prone position and get their carbines ready to go. Because they have carbines, they can put out a much higher volume of fire than the Confederates would expect. make them even think that perhaps there's infantry there once they get there. So, Heath continues to attack. About 10 o'clock, Reynolds gets to the battlefield at the very beginning of the first corps units that are getting there. And now you've got both Heath and the Confederates slamming straight up against first Buford, who's holding his own pretty well, and then Reynolds replaces his first corps regiments with Buford, who is pulled back now, because that's not what cavalry is supposed to be doing. And Heath decides, we've got the better of these people. We're going to press the attack. Now remember, that wasn't in the cards at all. But Heath also knows, and by the time Lee gets there, he has a little bit of a discussion with Heath. Is this the right place to have the battle? But eventually, Heath carries the day, and they decide to press the attack. In part because it's not just Heath, part of A.P. Hill's corps that's coming from the west. You also have Ewell's corps approaching from the north, from Carlisle area. Remember, that's where they were when the order to consolidate was happening. So it's touch and go. The first corps replaces. You've got the Iron Brigade is anchoring the left side of the Union line. They'd been famous at the Second Bull Run and very prominent thereafter. Been in a lot of battles, had their ranks depleted, but they proved their nickname at this particular battle once again. And you have reinforcements showing up from both sides, continuing to do so. The Confederates are initially repulsed at McPherson's Ridge by Reynolds' forces. Only an hour afterwards that Reynolds gets to the battlefield, he's hit in the head, actually in the neck. By the time he hits the ground, he's dead. But what he had already done is steel the nerve of the Union forces that were there, and most importantly of all, he had decided this is good terrain to fight a major battle on. He had basically committed the Union Army to fight at Gettysburg. The terrain wasn't the town itself. The key terrain, as far as Reynolds was concerned, were those two hills south of town. You've got Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. That's where he thought the battle ought to be fought. Those are the two pieces of terrain that must be held at all costs. Well, the battle just goes back and forth, as you always see in the Civil War. Units, regiment at a time, brigade at a time, committed back and forth. Archer's brigades come from the west. You have Davis's brigade now that's coming from the north. Remember that railroad cut? Here's a picture of the railroad cut. And the problem, once you get in the railroad cut, you can drive the Union forces out, but the Confederates got inside the cut, and that's way too deep. They can't fight themselves out of it. At a critical moment in time, the replacement for General Reynolds was General Doubleday, of Doubleday fame, you know, the founder of baseball. At least that's the theory. Anyway, he takes over command of the First Corps, and he commands the 6th Wisconsin, which was one of those regiments of the Iron Brigade, which was in reserve, to march all the way across the back of the battlefield, from the south end all the way to the north end of the battlefield, and charge right into the railroad cut. And they actually do that, an amazing speed and celerity, get to that cut, and some vicious fighting, but it ends with the commander of the 6th Wisconsin taking the surrender of the commander of the 2nd Mississippi in the midst of the cut right here. But that's the highlight for the Union. It doesn't all go well for the Union at that time. General Pender, another one of the divisions, part of A.P. Hill's corps, continues the attack. And here's the numbers. Because you've got one Union Corps versus one Confederate Corps, and the Confederate Corps is so much larger, it's just not going to go well if the Confederates deploy everything. They've got 8 rebel brigades versus 6 Union brigades. A little bit of a feel for what the combat is like in this part of the terrain. Remember, this is just day one. It's just getting started.
Up and down the line, men were reeling and falling, splinters flying from wheels and axles where bullets hit. In rear, horses tearing and plunging, mad with wounds or terror, drivers yelling, shells bursting, shot shrieking overhead, howling about our ears or throwing up great clouds of dust where they struck. The musketry crashing on 3 sides of us, bullets hissing, humming, and whistling everywhere. Smoke, dust, Splinters, blood, wreck, and carnage indescribable.
That's only half of what's going on in day one. The other half is what's going to be happening to the 11th Corps, which is arriving approximately at 12 noonish time frame and then moving north straight through Gettysburg, north into these positions. And at that same time now, General Early of Ewell's Corps is driving down from the north. So right here, this is a position right here it's worth taking a look at. Barlow's Knob. It's named Barlow's Knob because Barlow is the commander in that area. He moves forward because it's the most prominent piece of terrain in an otherwise very inconspicuous area of the battlefield. This is all pretty level terrain. But he's moving forward well in front of the rest of the Union lines. These are the units of the 11th Corps, and if you remember, von Gilsa's unit was the first unit to encounter Jackson's troops and the first unit to break back in May in Chancellorsville. Now they're put in an incredibly precarious position. A couple brigades against Early's division. And you can just see by the map right here that Avery's brigade is easily going to outflank them. Once you get outflanked, you've got the enemy in front of you and you got the enemy to your side with nothing else out there, you start to panic. And unfortunately, once again, Ames and von Gilsa are going to buckle under the attack of Jubal Early. There's 9 brigades here versus 4 brigades of Union. I should mention the 9 brigades versus 4 is only because there's 2 brigades that were posted down here on Cemetery Hill. Remember, that's what Reno identified as the key terrain. So let's put a couple brigades there right at the beginning. But it's not going to go well for von Gilsa and Ames, way up here in the front. They break at 3:15 in that neighborhood. By 4:15, you have a general retreat that starts in the 11th Corps and eventually is going to include the entire 1st Corps over here, which has done incredibly well, but suffered horrendous casualties trying to hold off an entire corps of the Confederates. And they retreat, move back through town. It gets really ugly. Many of them are captured as they retreat through Gettysburg. The Confederates are right on their heels. One general officer actually doesn't get captured only because he hides behind a woodpile, and he's going to spend the rest of the battle hiding in the wood near this woodpile and relying on the kindness of a citizen of Gettysburg to give him a few scraps of bread to keep him alive. But the rest of the army now goes to Cemetery Hill. 2 demoralized corps. The 11th Corps is really in a shambles, and the 1st Corps, as I mentioned, has taken a tremendous bloodletting. Now, what do the folks over here in the 1st Corps think about their colleagues, their comrades in the 11th Corps? Here's a quote from Colonel Wainwright of the 1st Corps Artillery. Not supposed to do that.
As soon as the rebels began to fire, the 2 lines of Deutschmen in front of the batteries began to run, and nearly the whole of them cleared out. I pitied General Ames most heartily. His men did not stand at all, save one. I believe not a single regiment of the 11th Corps exposed to the attack stood fire, but ran away almost to a man. Stuart stretched his men along the road with fence rails to try to stop the runaways, but could do nothing. Officers and men, however, got a supper. They had been without food all day. For when they knocked the Deutschman down, they took his haversack from him.
Okay. One other point here. Lee's on the battlefield by this time. It's getting close to the end of the day. He feels his blood up. This is the time to take advantage of the success that Ewell has had in the north. And so he directs Ewell, he sends him a courier to order Ewell to continue the attack, except the order is one of those conditional orders that Lee typically likes to give. Continue the attack and seize Cemetery Hill if practicable. If practicable. Those 2 words could make a big difference in this entire battle. As far as Ewell's concerned, his soldiers are pretty well exhausted. it wasn't practical for him to continue the assault. So that doesn't happen on the night of day one. And this is where they form up. By this time, General Hancock, who's the commander of the 2nd Corps, has ridden forward with instructions from General Meade to take command of all of the forces that are already there at Gettysburg. And the rest of the Union Army is rapidly going to be occupying the town that evening. It's an interesting choice because Oliver Howard easily outranks Hancock. He's got the data rank by a long shot, and I think Doubleday does as well. But by this time, Meade had the authority given to him by Halleck, I believe, to ignore date of rank and appoint the people he thought were best able to command. And Hancock was definitely the right choice for this. And as soon as they get there, they're going to start to build barricades and to dig in, because they're expecting the Confederates to attack, obviously. Meade's plan then. What should they do? Once they've got the commanders there, to stay on the defensive. They've got the advantage in a couple respects, and it's important to look at the terrain right here. Now, don't need to pay too much attention to the timeline that you're looking at here. This is a little bit ahead of the time from what we're going to have initially. He gets his units together. He's got the 12th Corps is going to occupy this portion, Culp's Hill and below, Slocum's Corps. You've got the 11th Corps, Howard, and the 1st Corps right here, basically on Cemetery Hill and just below that. In the center of the line now is Hancock's 2nd Corps. And remember, he's basically the commander of this portion of the battlefield. And then, farther south, is Sickles' 3rd Corps. The instructions essentially were to extend from Hancock's left all the way down to the anchor of the line, which is going to be down here in Little Round Top. Little Round Top, because Big Round Top, even though it's higher, is heavily wooded. And the western slope of Little Round Top is been forested. It's basically open terrain, very rocky terrain, but open terrain. So that's where Sickles is supposed to go, right through here. So what you've got is this inverted fish hook. And also what you have is interior lines. You're going to have Sykes' 5th Corps and Sedgwick's 6th Corps that are eventually going to get there as well. Both of those divisions are going to serve as reinforcements, the reserves for General Meade. And he can move them around pretty easily because he's going to have interior lines moving back and forth. What you have for Lee and Longstreet and Hill and Ewell, they're on the exterior of this. If Lee wants to move some of Ewell's forces over here to the right flank, they've got to go all the way around to the side. Much bigger difference. A word about General Sickles then. General Sickles is a very interesting character. He hails from New York. He's a politician. By the time you get to the Civil War, he's in Congress, but prior to that, he had been in the New York legislature. And while he was in the New York legislature, he was actually censured by the New York legislature because at one point in time he brought a prostitute into the legislature, and they didn't take lightly to that. In fact, he took the same prostitute and introduced her over to, took her over to England and introduced her to Queen Victoria. And actually, the name he used was one of his political enemies back in New York. She was going by that name. He also got into some other scrapes. He married a woman half his age when he was in his 30s. He married a 15-year-old woman who was well-read, obviously. She spoke several languages, but I'm sure people were raising eyebrows over it. It wasn't too many years later that he heard that she was having an affair. Well, she was having an affair with Francis Scott Key's son. And they got into a scuffle, a duel perhaps, and it turns out that Sickles killed Francis Scott Key's son. He goes to trial. One of his lawyers is Edwin Stanton. See, it's a small world back then, who's going to be the Secretary of the Army later on. And Stanton manages to get him acquitted, claiming that he was maddened and temporarily insane when he committed this act. So I guess you could say he was the first guy to get off because of temporary insanity. But now he's commander of the 3rd Corps in the Union Army. And he goes forward, and about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when he's sitting up here, he's looking across this terrain, and he says, you know, out here at this peach orchard right around here in the Emmetsburg Pike, it sure looks like that's a little bit higher terrain. That'd be better for me to fight on than up here. So he moves his entire corps, without getting permission to do so, towards the Emmetsburg Pike. And when he does so, he encounters Meade, who is terribly upset with him. And got to find the right quote here, searching for it. Anyway, here's what happens. They're looking at the terrain, and basically Meade says, what in the world did you move your forces down there for? And Sickles tries to explain, well, it's better terrain down there, General. I think that's a better place for us to fight. And about that time, Sickles says, no, you need to move your forces back here. And then he sees that the Confederates are finally starting to engage them, and says, looks like they've decided you're going to fight down there as well. So that's how that's going to work for them. Here's Lee's plan. His frame of mind, first of all, he still doesn't have his cavalry. He decides that Gettysburg, though, is going to be the place where he's going to fight. And he also knows that most of Longstreet's corps is still not there. Hood is rapidly closing in with one division. Pickett is not going to be there for at least another day. And the reason Pickett's not there is because he's back in Chambersburg, because Lee doesn't know where the enemy was, and so he had to leave one of his divisions in Chambersburg until he finds out what's going on with Stuart. So Pickett's out of the picture for a while. Longstreet's suggestion, and this is going to be very important because the two generals are now really going to be fighting over the strategic and the tactical vision they have for this battle. Longstreet's suggestion is basically, General, let's take the entire army, basically disengage from where we're at right now, swing way to the south, get someplace between Meade's forces and the pike down to Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Essentially get between Meade and Washington, D.C., thinking that Meade's going to have to respond to that. And if not that, maybe we can do a tactical movement. So you're not going to go nearly as far, but you still get down on the south side of the Union forces into a blocking position. The notion is, in Longstreet's mind, it's much better to be on the tactical defense, to let the enemy attack you. Strategic, you pick the terrain. Tactical, you let them attack. And he thinks back to Fredericksburg, that horrendous experience the Union had at Fredericksburg. It's worth listening to the quote that we've got here for Longstreet.
If we could have chosen a point to meet our plans of operation, I do not think we could have found a better one than that upon which they are now concentrating. All we have to do is throw our army around by their left, and we shall interpose between the Federal army and Washington. We can get a strong position and wait. And if they fail to attack us, we shall have everything in condition to move back tomorrow night in the direction of Washington, selecting beforehand a good position into which we can place our troops to receive battle next day. Finding our object is Washington, and that army, the Federals, will be sure to attack us. When they attack, we shall beat them, as we proposed to do before we left Fredericksburg. And the probabilities are that the fruits of our success will be great.
Lee's response essentially was, if the enemy is there tomorrow, we must attack him. Lee knows exactly where they're at. He's audacious. He always wants to be on the offensive. He wants to be on the offensive because that means he has the initiative. Longstreet's response, if he is there, it will be because he is anxious that we should attack him. A good reason, in my judgment, for not doing so. So there's real tension for the first time, you're really seeing some real tension between the senior leaders in the Army of Northern Virginia. And I'm not sure that it's something that Lee was used to or entirely comfortable with. Who would be? You've got some serious contention from some of your most respected officer. Later on, he gets with Ewell and basically suggests to Ewell, maybe we should move south, kind of borrowing some of Longstreet's plan. And Ewell says, General, we fought over this terrain. My soldiers would be demoralized if we were to leave Gettysburg now, leave the city. We won this terrain. We should stay here and fight. And so now you've got another general trying to argue with him. Lee opts to stay and fight at Gettysburg. That's the bottom line for day 2. At the time, it's going to be a coordinated attack. Somewhere in the morning, he wants Ewell to attack up Culp's Hill and Longstreet to attack on the Union left flank. And when they were discussing it, they didn't think there was any Union forces down here. In fact, Longstreet had done a brief reconnaissance, hadn't got all the way that they should have, but thought that Little Round Top was totally vacant, that there was no Union forces here. And for a while, they were probably correct. So that's the plan. The other part of the plan then, once they do a launch on Longstreet's front, to do en echelon, which means that first you have a unit on the right flank attack, and then right down line, like dominoes, each brigade attacks in succession. And the thought was those first brigades would push forward and start to cave in the Union line. They'd start to back up, and then you can see where the dominoes would really build on the Union side, and the whole line would collapse. That's the theory, at least. One thing that's wrong with this right here, Hood gets replaced later in the next day only because he just arrived on the battlefield. The attack was initially planned for McLaws' division instead. But moving forward, July 2nd, the bloodiest day at Gettysburg. It's just about ready to begin now. The problem was, although it's supposed to start early in the morning, it doesn't happen that way. Longstreet gets delayed a couple reasons. One, he's still waiting for Hood's elements to arrive. Another reason, part of the plan was that he had to move his forces over to the Union left flank, over to the Confederate right flank here, in such a way that the Union couldn't see what was going on. And they got out to about here and realized, you can watch everything that we're doing. So they had to backtrack. Anything like this takes time. You always get the estimates of how long things take wrong when you're in combat. They had to backtrack, come back up this way, go through the ridge right here so they can get behind McPherson's ridge, basically, and down here where they're in a more hidden position, and then move forward with McLaws' forces. And then when you change the plan and decide it's not just going to be McLaws, it's going to be Hood. Once he arrives on the battlefield, that delays it further. Anyway, by this time, by early afternoon, Lee is getting very anxious and uptight about the whole thing because the plan is already going awry as far as he's concerned, and he's a little bit upset. Part of this also is that Longstreet is feeling a little bit slighted by Lee himself because that evening, Lee started to do something that Longstreet thought was peculiar, bypassing Longstreet and giving orders to division and brigade commanders directly. So he got a little, I don't know what's exactly in his mind, but the story is he got a little bit upset about that. So the communication between these two key leaders is not as good as it should be at that time. 4 o'clock, the rebel artillery starts, and their target is at the Peach Orchard primarily, is a real soft spot. 4 o'clock is also the time that Hood's division is going to attack in the Devil Dens area up towards Little Round Top. And by 4:30, they're well into the Devil's Dens area. The next position we have to look at then is that right flank and Hood's attacking position. Roughly about the same time, General Governor Warren, who is Meade's chief engineer officer, is scouting ahead and actually rode up to Little Round Top and realized, oh my gosh, there's a signal detachment up there with their signal flags. And that was it. And he looked at the terrain and says, this is an important piece of terrain. Of course, Sickles had kind of evacuated all of that. and realize he's got to get somebody up there as quickly as he can, because they can already see in the distance some glimmer of bayonets that obviously the Confederates, under Hood in this case, are getting ready to attack. So he rides back with the intention of going to the 5th Corps commander and saying, you need to send somebody forward, and runs into the commander of one of those brigades from the 5th Corps under the command of Colonel Strong Vincent, who wonders what's going on and realizes this is a key moment and takes it upon himself to order his entire brigade to Little Round Top. And in his brigade is the 20th Maine. And here's a name that rings familiar to almost many of you at least. Colonel Joshua Chamberlain is the commander of the 20th Maine, which has got 300 some soldiers by that time. You know, the regiment starts with 1,000. They whittled down to in the neighborhood of 200 plus. They got reinforced by a renegade group of Maine mutineers, if you will, by about 120 right before the battle begins. So here's this hodgepodge organization that Chamberlain has to anchor the entire left flank of the Union Army with on Little Round Top, just as the Confederates are going to attack. 4:30, Law's brigade occupies Round Top. Don't get confused. This right here. Now look at, it's entirely wooded. Only half of Little Round Top is wooded. But this is a great launching pad as they attack straight down the slopes into the positions that the Union have. At 4:45, the attack begins on Little Round Top. This is only minutes before the Union had actually gotten there. Chamberlain refuses his line. What that means is he took half of his unit and told them to basically turn to the left flank. So now he's got this angle, and he's going to be attacked by the 15th and the 47th Alabama. Two regiments are going to be bearing in on him in his position. The rebels, the 15th and 47th, continue the attack. And we need to see what Colonel Oates, the commander of the 15th, says about the battle. In this very brutal back and forth campaign.
I again ordered the advance, waving my sword, shouting, "Forward, men, to the ledge!" and was promptly followed by the command in splendid style. The 20th Maine fell back to the next ridge, then charged my line, coming right up in hand-to-hand encounter. A Maine man reached to grasp the staff of the colors when Ensign Archibald stepped back and Sergeant Pat O'Connor stove his bayonet through the head of a Yankee.
In the crucial moment of the battle, after a long engagement back and forth, and Chamberlain's troops are practically out of ammunition completely, even after they've rummaged through the dead and the wounded, the Confederates that they've encountered, scraping up as much ammunition as they had, realize they don't have enough ammunition to repulse one more Confederate assault. So here's a crucial point in American history, if you will, because this is an important piece of terrain. Chamberlain decides, rather than withdraw, to have his soldiers fix bayonets and charge into the advancing Confederates. And imagine the surprise of the 15th Alabama as they see these Union forces spilling off the top of the ridgeline and carry the day. Here is a short excerpt of how Chamberlain described the battle years later.
We opened a brisk fire at close range, which was so sudden and effective that they soon fell back, only to burst forth again with a shout, and rapidly advanced, firing as they came. It did not seem possible to withstand another shock like this now coming on. The edge of the conflict swayed to and fro, with wild whirlpools and eddies. At times I saw around me more of the enemy than of my own men. Gaps opening, swallowing, closing again. Squads of stalwart men who had cut their way through us, disappearing as if translated. All around, a strange, mingled roar.
That happens at 6 o'clock. We're going to jump back a little bit because the combat that's going on in the rest of Longstreet's line is every bit as brutal and desperate. But this is a key moment in part because if the Confederates had gained Little Round Top, then been able to haul their artillery up, they could have fired right down the line of the Union forces as they were, the rest of the Union forces on Seminary Ridge, they would have been pretty vulnerable. The wheat field and peach orchard. 4 o'clock again is when that initial artillery barrage begins against the peach orchard, some artillery units that the Union had there. 4:30, you've got the 1st Brigade under Robertson attacks into Rose Woods. Now that's actually not into the peach orchard area, but towards the wheat field, if you will. By 5 o'clock, another brigade moves forward and attacks towards the wheat field. And I want you to notice a couple things here. I did this deliberately. In this, boy, I didn't do that deliberately. In this case, the wheat field is lowercase. These places, Devil's Den, wheat field, peach orchard, become so significant in the lore of the Civil War and the lore that's attached to the Battle of Gettysburg that they are now proper names. Wheat field and peach orchard. And more than any other battle you can think of, it's a cottage industry of the kinds of painting and artwork and things that are meant to memorialize this particular battle. And so I've picked quite a few of these as we go through the next few slides. Here's the 4th Michigan in the wheat field. Another give and take, back and forth. The rebels throw in one regiment or a brigade. The Confederates are serving, or they're sending in other units as well. Meade is coordinating much of this. Hancock is coordinating much of this. And what's happening as the battle goes back and forth over the next few hours, the 3rd Corps isn't all that's going to be able to hold the line. Everybody recognize that. So Meade starts sending in units from the 5th Corps and from the 6th Corps. He starts pulling units from the 12th Corps on Culp's Hill and from the 2nd Corps, all being fed into this part of the battlefield as it goes back and forth. Both sides are committing reinforcements. Here's another quote that gives you a sense of the sounds of what it must have been like with this cannon and rifle shot and the screams and the horses and everything else that's going on. And this is a Massachusetts private we're going to listen to here.
The hoarse and indistinguishable orders of commanding officers, the screaming and bursting of shells, canister and shrapnel as they tore through the struggling masses of humanity, the death screams of wounded animals, the groans of their human companions, wounded and dying, and trampled underfoot by hurrying batteries, riderless horses, and the moving lines of battle. A perfect hell on earth, never, perhaps, to be equaled, certainly not to be surpassed, nor ever to be forgotten in a man's lifetime. It has never been effaced from my memory, day or night, for 50 years.
He's not the only one. This battle, for whoever was there, this battle is going to stay with their memories. 6 o'clock, Barksdale Mississippian Brigade attacks the Union forces at the peach orchard. Now, they'd had attacks there already, but this is the one that's really going to carry the day. And they move forward. Now, this is exactly the same time as you recall that the final climactic action at Little Round Top is going on. 6 o'clock, it's going exactly the opposite direction. The Confederates are beginning to move forward. And suddenly there's this huge gap in the Union lines as the Confederates, or the Union starts to withdraw. 2 more brigades are fed into the attack. Sickles' headquarters, which is a little bit farther up the slope, is taking fire. He mounts on. He's nothing if not brave and conspicuous in his performance in the battlefield, but he takes a round shot through his leg, and he's seriously injured now. Taken off his horse, put on a stretcher, and here's the next chapter of Sickles' very colorful life. He's on the stretcher, smoking a cigar, still encouraging his soldiers forward as they haul him off to the battlefield, and once he gets to the surgeon's tent, insists that they hold on to his leg so he can preserve the leg bone that had been cut off. And that's what it is right there. That's Sickles' leg bone that for the rest of his life was going to be on display in a museum up in Washington, D.C. And how do the soldiers from the 2nd Corps feel about this now that Sickles' been injured? Here's one quote. "The loss of his leg is a great gain to us, whatever it may be to him." Okay. I've got Confederate high water mark here. It's a matter of debate. Most people would say it's at the height of Pickett's charge. But this is really the greatest success at this particular point. It's Barksdale's brigade continuing right into the gap that had been formed now as these forces right here start to disintegrate. Here's Barksdale's brigade coming through here like this. And they're all hustling back as quick as they can, and Hancock is desperate now to form some kind of a defensive line right along the ridge line, what little ridge line there is for Cemetery Ridge. And he can find nobody except one small Minnesota regiment of a couple hundred soldiers. They had seen action in practically every major battle up to this point, and they had only a couple hundred soldiers left in their particular regiment. But he feeds the 1st Minnesota into this. And the orders that they get is attack, Colonel, and take those colors. And Colonel Colville, the commander of the unit, says, I immediately gave the order, forward, double quick, and under a galling fire from the enemy, we advanced. And again, it's one of those moments that has been immortalized in paintings, the 1st Minnesota's attack. Unfortunately, they did stop the Confederates, put them on their heels long enough that Hancock can form some kind of a defensive line behind them, and suffered something in the neighborhood of 82% casualties in doing so. That gives you the scale of the bloodshed that's going on throughout this area. It's about this time that Crawford's division from the 5th Corps arrives, more reinforcements being fed into this area, and finally the Confederates face reality and start to withdraw. Now they hold possession of the peach orchard, they hold possession of the wheat field. These are fairly far forward for them, but they can't take Seminary Ridge. It just was not going to happen. Longstreet, having observed all of this, and he's also very conspicuous in his role on the battlefield, here's the comment he had about that particular day on the battlefield. It was the best 3 hours of fighting by soldiers on any battlefield. From somebody like Longstreet, that's saying a lot. So, that does not end what's going to be happening on the 2nd of July. And again, that's 150 years ago today. Culp's Hill. Now remember, Lee wanted to have the attack on Culp's Hill by Ewell's Corps and Longstreet's Corps on Seminary Ridge happening roughly the same time in the morning. Well, Culp's Hill doesn't get attacked until 7:15 p.m. And I'd already mentioned that before that time, Meade had robbed a lot of the forces that were on Culp's Hill to feed into the line on Seminary Ridge. There was only one brigade left on Culp's Hill by that time. It was a brigade under the command of a Colonel Green, who was an engineer by training, and he'd spent the day having his soldiers build as robust of barricades as they possibly could. Interesting that whatever reason the Union forces weren't necessarily doing that as much as they could have on Seminary Ridge, but they were on Culp's Hill. So they were attacking into, the Confederates are now going to attack into these barricades. The only problem is Greene with his 1,300 some men didn't have nearly enough to man all the barricades once they'd been stripped away. His troops had been stripped away. So now you've got something like 6,000 rebels attacking at 7:15 against his 1,300 who are dug in behind these barricades. That also goes seesawing back and forth. Part of the barricades are actually occupied on Culp's Hill by Confederate forces right next to the 137th New York, which doggedly holds part of its barricaded position for quite a few hours before they're finally forced out. I should also mention 745, Early's division, another division out of Ewell's Corps, is going to be attacking Cemetery Hill. Remember that picture that we saw before? Evergreen Cemetery? That's the gate to the cemetery as the Confederates are attacking towards that. Finally, at 9:15, the combat on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill is going to end. It's been quite a day. And it's time to start planning for what's going to be happening the next day. Meade conducts a council of war that night on July the 2nd. He gets all of his corps commanders together. He gets Governor Warren, that engineer officer, General Hunt, his artillery officer, together, and basically gives them 3 questions to consider. Should we stay where we're at? Should the Army of the Potomac stay right here in Gettysburg? And the answer was a unanimous yes. Should we defend or attack? And almost a unanimous consent on this one as well. Defend. Once you got to that point, then the third question was obvious. For how long? If Lee doesn't do anything, how long should we wait? And the answer was generally, at least a day, and then we'll see what Lee's doing and respond to what Lee does. But the thought was, knowing Lee's mind, that he probably was going to attack. The last piece of advice then that Meade is going to give, is to General Gibbon, who is essentially the commander of the Second Corps because General Hancock was commanding the left flank of the Army. So General Gibbon, the former he got his start as the commander of the Iron Brigade, by the way, a seasoned soldier, an excellent commander. This is the advice he's given by Meade. Meade says to me, if Lee attacks tomorrow, it will be in your front. I asked him why he thought so, and he replied, because he has made attacks on both of our flanks and failed, and if he concludes to try it again, it will be on our center. And here's Gibbon's thoughts. I expressed a hope that he would, and told General Meade with confidence that if he did, we would defeat him. So you're almost inviting Lee to attack exactly where Meade wants him to. So what's going on the other side, on the Confederate side? That's a very different story. And you can begin to see the relationship of the Confederate commanders. It's strained already on day 2, but it's going to continue that way. And what doesn't happen this night, and that's a reflection in part of how Lee likes to command, is he doesn't have a council of war. He sends couriers back and forth. He does have General Stuart finally arrive about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 2nd. Now, if you watch the movie Gettysburg, if you read Killer Angels, there's all this wonderful dialogue that's supposed to be happening between Lee and Stuart. It's doubtful if any of that actually happened. What is reported is that one of the comments that Lee said to Stuart, "Well, General, you are here at last." From Lee, that's a pretty stiff reprimand. And I'm sure that Stuart felt that. Here's what Shelby Foote said, and you probably have heard this as well if you watched the Gettysburg series, the Civil War series. General, I bring you 200 Yankee wagons full of supplies. And Lee's response, General, they are an impediment to me now. I ask that you help me whip these people. So, Stuart's finally there. His troopers are riding hard. They're going to be there later that night. Pickett's division will soon be there as well. So there's a couple of things that are going to be different now for Lee. He's got his cavalry finally, and he's got that new division that has not been committed to battle up to this point. And there's a little bit of dialogue, not directly, between he and Longstreet. Orders for July 3rd. The attack would the attack would be renewed at daylight. Basically, just a repetition of the night before. And we're going to see that's going to be tweaked the next day. 4:30 in the morning, the Union starts this time, and they now have the initiative. Small as it might be, they're setting the stage for this change that's going to occur in Longstreet's plan because they attacked at Culp's Hill by starting a vicious artillery duel with those units that had seized part of the breastworks the evening before. That goes on for close to 7 hours, back and forth, as they jockey for position. By this time, General Geary's division had reoccupied some of Culp's Hill. They were moving forces back and forth between Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. By noon, the Confederates start in a serious way with their assaults. And again, it goes on back and forth. And what also occurs now, it's obvious to Lee that a coordinated attack on the 3rd is not going to happen because the Union had seized the initiative and it's obviously that Ewell's not going to be able to attack by the time that Longstreet's forces are ready. So some adjustments have to be made. I already mentioned the initial plan. Let's talk a little bit about the Union preparation, because that's important. Cemetery Hill positions and Cemetery Ridge. Here's Cemetery Hill and extending down the ridge line. And I already told you that this really tapers off as you go farther south. Right here in the center of this is a stone wall. It's not a very high wall. It's probably about this high. And then the Union throws some wooden rails on top of that to bolster that a little bit. I believe it's also the farmhouse for a freedman slave who had been living there for a while. Right here is an angle in that particular stone wall that will forever after be known as the angle. And right adjacent to that is a group of trees, a copse of trees is what they referred to it as at the time. This eventually is going to be the aiming point for the entire Confederate Army for that attack. You see Hancock to raise his forces here. And what you have on the south side then is Lee, and his plan now has evolved. And what we're going to see is Lee wants to have an attack kicked off by Pickett and his forces. Longstreet starts to appeal to him that that's not nearly enough, that he needs to have a lot more into this attack than just Pickett's division. So Lee turns to A.P. Hill's corps and gets, sorry for my being so clumsy on this, he gets Pettigrew. Actually, there's going to be 3 brigades right here under Pickett, and you've got 6 brigades here under Pettigrew and Trimble. So A.P. Hill is going to contribute more to this assault than Longstreet is, and that Pickett is. But it remains named Pickett's charge here to history today. Anderson's a couple brigades here in a supporting attack that got into the action a little bit later. But you can see how all of this is going to be centered right here on the angle. And that's the plan. And here's the dialogue. More important dialogue between Longstreet and Lee. He wants to renew the attack on Cemetery Ridge. And Longstreet tries to argue against it. He's still trying to convince him to go around the end, go around the south side. He's already had scouts going out to look at that area. And Lee says, the enemy is there and I'm going to strike him. And here's the response that many of you heard before. General, I have been a soldier all my life. I have been engaged in fights by the couples, by squads, companies, regiments, divisions, and armies. And it is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position. That's Longstreet to Lee. That's how strongly Longstreet is against this idea of this attack. The Union is there. They're watching the Confederates line up. It just doesn't look like it's going well. And it's going to be successful at all. Longstreet's convinced it can't be. Lee, ever confident in his soldiers, thinks that he can carry the day. Part of the reason is because he's going to start with this horrendous artillery barrage. And that artillery barrage is aimed at the Union artillery to take them out or force them off the battlefield, and then start to deplete the Union forces that are under this, the trench lines, behind the stone wall, behind these wooden rails, to deplete them to the point where it's going to be at least an even match. And then he's going to throw something like 12,500 troops at that line against the Union that are entrenched in there. Here's the forces that he's got at his hand. General Pickett, I've already talked about Pettigrew and Trimble up in the northern part, but here's the ones that we've heard so much about. General Pickett with the 3 brigade commanders, General Garnett, General James Kemper, General Lou Armistead, leading the 3 brigades of Pickett's division. Here's another little anecdote of Gettysburg history. General Armistead and General Reynolds and General Hancock all served together in California. Immediately prior to the start of the war, those 3 men were best of friends serving together in California. And it was weighing heavily on Armistead's mind that he was not going to have to be fighting and attacking against his very good friend Hancock on the other side of Seminary Ridge. A little bit more about the artillery barrage. The Confederate preparations. What had happened prior to the actual artillery barrage beginning? William Pendleton was the commander of the Confederate artillery, though he didn't have the same centralized control that the Union side had. The corps commanders retained that. And Pendleton, although he was a trained officer and a West Point officer, didn't have a good feel for the battlefield as well. A couple things are going to be happening here on Pendleton's side. The artillery is up front. The infantry is going to wait for the attack to begin well behind those artillery positions. And the whole idea of this artillery barrage, as I already talked about, is to take out the enemy artillery and soften up the infantry. Part of the problem, though, was to keep the ammunition out of range. They moved the ammunition too far back. So far back they aren't going to be able to resupply in the midst of the battle itself. On the Union side, you have General Henry Hunt, who's a different kind of sort, who relished the notion of being in charge of everything, who personally positioned most of the artillery, positioned where not just the artillery was, but the artillery trains with all the extra ammunition, artillery reserve with extra batteries that they could rush into some of the hot spots later on in the battle. And then he goes through and talks to all his artillery commanders and tells them, when the rebel artillery starts, do not waste your ammunition firing on the rebel artillery. Wait 15 or 20 minutes. And then when you do fire back, do it at a very slow, deliberate pace, because what I want you to do is to have plenty of ammunition when the infantry assault begins. That's our main target. It's not the enemy artillery, it's the infantry. 1:07, pretty precise time. People were paying attention, checking their watches when that started, when the artillery barrage started. And it was intense. General Hancock in the center of the line with the Second Corps is amazed that the Union artillery isn't responding, because General Hunt hadn't talked to him about it. So he starts going up and down the line and telling his artillery, fire, for God's sakes, fire. This is demoralizing my troops, fire. And he's able to convince a few of them until he finally gets the message later on. But the bottom line is that the artillery in his part of the line, which is going to be facing Pickett's portion of the charge, depletes most of their long-range ammunition in the process of this 45-minute artillery duel. About 30 minutes into it, there's real concern on Longstreet's mind again. And here's what Longstreet tells Porter Alexander, who is in charge of his corps artillery. Colonel, if artillery fire does not have the effect to drive off the enemy or greatly demoralize him so as to make our efforts pretty certain, I would prefer that you should not advise Pickett to make the charge. I shall rely a great deal upon your judgment to determine the matter, and shall expect you to let General Pickett know when the moment offers. For an artillery colonel to have the decision thrust upon him of when the infantry attack should begin, that's quite a responsibility that Longstreet had just given to him. But it gives you another look into the mindset of Longstreet at the time as well. The artillery barrage goes on for 45 minutes. After this brief exchange between Alexander and Longstreet, we have this exchange. Porter Alexander sends a message to Pickett. General, if you are to advance at all, you must come at once, or we will not be able to support you as we ought. Meaning that he was running out of ammunition. He had little else to fire. And there wasn't time to go back to the Confederate artillery trains and get that ammunition and bring it forward. It just wasn't going to be, that would take practically an hour to do that. So, Alexander a little bit later writes another note. For God's sake, come quick. They just saw where the Union artillery fire starts to slacken measurably. And it looks like the Union is withdrawing their artillery guns away from the line. So here's the moment they've been waiting for. For God's sake, come quick. The 18 guns are gone. Come quick or my ammunition will not let you be supported properly. Pickett finds Longstreet, approaches him, goes up and asks Longstreet, I'm going forward now, sir. No, excuse me, General, shall I advance? Longstreet says nothing. He merely nods. And that's when Pickett says, I'm going to move forward, sir. And the attack is ready to begin. So, 3 o'clock now. The most famous attack in American military history is ready to be launched. Pickett rallies his forces. You can imagine the speeches that are given to the Confederate soldiers all across the line. Here's one of the things that Pickett says, up men and to your post. Don't forget today that you are from old Virginia. Spoken like true states' rights. And they begin to move forward. As they move forward, what you have here on the left, you've got a long expanse before they get to the Emmitsburg Road. And in this part of the line, the Union artillery has not wasted their ammunition, so they can engage the Confederates at a long range with shell and shot, exploding shell. You get over into the midst of them, and sometimes you get an exploding shell that hits at the right place. You can take 5 or 10 men out. And what the Confederates do every time something like that happens, they're taking a swath of the line out as they move forward. They just simply close ranks. And again, everybody is focusing in on this one place of copse of trees right here at the angle. That's where they're all headed. So already at a much farther range, at 1,000 yards out, the Confederates on the left flank are being engaged. As they move forward, the 8th Ohio is right here and catches them in the flank. As they get close to the Emmitsburg Road right here, they discover, they knew already, they just couldn't get to it, there's a fence on each side of that road that they have to climb over. As they climb over, they're well within range of the Union infantry. And what the Union infantry had done on this part of the line is stacked regiment upon regiment. They moved everybody forward. Instead of holding people in reserve, they moved regiments forward. So there's 2, 4 people thick. And in many cases, there would be a soldier up front who would fire and simply have the rifles pass forward to him, so there'd be a continuous, steady, rolling fire coming from these lines right here. It does not go well at all. Although this Brockenbrough's brigade is the first to break, it only gets about this far. The other 3 brigades move forward and get all the way here, but they are decimated. And especially so when the 8th Ohio hits them in the flank. Now look also, artillery in Cemetery Hill right here, as they can fire right down the gullet of Emmitsburg Road. Enfilading fire, devastating fire. Meanwhile, on the right side of the line, you've got Pickett moving forward with his 3 brigades. And to be able to focus on the right part of the Union line, they not only get across the Emmitsburg Road with not nearly as much trouble because their pickets have been able to take those fences down. They're far enough away from the Union lines. Once they get past that, though, they have to flank to the left and basically walk in front of the enemy line as they're taking fire from the enemy, both artillery and infantry fire, as well as artillery fire from up here, until they can wheel on around and hit the angle like they're supposed to. In the process of doing that, Garnett is hit and killed. Kemper is hit and seriously injured, almost captured by the Union forces until Confederates recapture him, his body, and then drag him off to the rear. And Armistead.
More than half a mile their
Okay, I did want to play this.
More than half a mile their front extends, man touching man, rank pressing rank. The red flags wave, their horsemen gallop up and down, the arms of 13,000 men, barrel and bayonet gleam in the sun, a sloping forest of flashing steel. Right on they move as with one soul, in perfect order without impediment of ditch or wall or stream, over ridge and slope, through orchard and meadow and cornfield, magnificent, grim, irresistible.
So that's one artist's rendition of what the battlefield looked like that day. Here is one of the most famous moments of the Civil War. Armistead leading his troops, his Virginians, into that angle, into the enemy artillery, as they begin to turn the enemy artillery. And he does so by having them guide on the hat that he put on his sword and moving forward. And he tells them, give them cold steel, boys. But we know the story. Not too long after this, he's shot, collapses right next to one of the enemy artillery, and soon the Union feed more reinforcements in there, and this is the high point that many people look at. There was a brigade of Confederate infantry that made the angle, at least the remnants of a brigade that made it, a few hundred men, and they are forced back. And by 3:45, the whole Confederate line now is collapsing back towards friendly lines on Seminary Ridge. And as they get back, they encounter Robert E. Lee. And his comments to them as they come back into the Seminary Ridge line, it's all my fault. It's all my fault. He also encounters General Pickett when he comes back, and tells Pickett, General, get your division ready for a counterattack. And Pickett's answer to General Lee, General, I have no division now. And to a certain extent, he was right. At least a third to a half of his forces were out in the battlefield someplace, captured, injured, or killed. Okay, I'm going to move very quickly through the last couple slides here. Just the couple highlights. I wanted to put this up just to say that there was cavalry action also on the 3rd of July. Their mission, the Confederates, were to get around the eastern side of the Union line to try to get all the way down to Baltimore Pike to cut the line of communications. Stuart tried to do that. He ran into a couple divisions under David Gregg, and for those of you who are interested in people like George Armstrong Custer, this is where he comes to prominence and basically turns the tide in some swirling melees of cavalry action, sabers and against sabers and pistols, etc., like that. One of the things that he is known for saying at this time, he leads a brigade, a brand new command for him, by the way, a brigade of Michiganders, and he says, "Come on, you Wolverines," as he charges in, always at the front. July 3rd ends horribly for Lee. That evening he decides they have to pull back. By the 4th, they're moving back. It's raining by this time in the battlefield. And again, to move through this fairly quickly, the Confederates go this direction, through the gap in South Mountain, swinging down to the south into Pennsylvania and Maryland, with the intent of crossing here at Williamsport and Falling Water. Because of the rain, the Potomac was flooding at the time, so they're going to be bottled up there for a few days. But they get to the river long before the Union gets there, because the Union is going this route, much longer route. And you can criticize Meade for not taking after Lee as quickly as he should have, but roughly a few hours or a day afterwards, he's already got his soldiers on a forced march as well. But here's where the debate really begins. Lincoln is pleading and prodding with Meade, crush the Confederates now. You've got them bottled up. They can't get across the Potomac. That's the time to attack. They're demoralized. You've got the advantage. Meade gets another general's council and asks his council, what should we do? Should we attack? And basically, the unanimous consent was no. By this time, Hancock was not in command of the Second Corps. He'd been injured, severely injured. Reynolds is not in command of the First Corps. He had been killed that first day. Those were his two most aggressive, best commanders. They're both out of the picture. Howard, well, his corps had failed twice miserably. Sedgwick wasn't necessarily the kind of commander you want to put your trust into. So Meade had a real conundrum. and the decision is that they would not attack. By July 13th and 14th, the rebels are able to get across the river and get back into Virginia again. The aftermath of the battle, this is just some of the many people who were killed or injured. And obviously, it picked the senior leadership. It's especially painful for the Confederates. You can't replace leaders like this. Archer had been captured the first day. The ones that are in red here were killed. Pender, Garnett, and Armistead, of course, brigade commanders in the Pickett's division. Pender was a division commander. Hood was injured seriously on day 2. Heath was injured in his attack. These are people that Lee is not going to be able to replace. The same is true for the Union, although not quite as bad for them. You can see the ugly nature of the battlefield. The cameramen descended on the battlefield a couple days afterwards and started taking pictures. There were thousands of dead. There were 3,000 horses on the battlefield as well, scattered about in all kinds of different locations. And it would be a gruesome task to take care of those casualties. And to give you a real sense of what it had to be like to do that job.
The dead bodies of men and horses had lain there, putrefying under the summer sun for 3 days. Corpses swollen to twice their original size. Some of them actually burst asunder with the pressure of foul gases and vapors. Several human or inhuman corpses sat upright against a fence, with arms extended in the air and faces hideous with something very like a fixed leer, as if taking a fiendish pleasure in showing us what we essentially were and might at any moment become.
Here's a sense of the casualties just in that last day. Now remember, day 2 was the worst day as far as casualties are concerned, but in Pickett's charge, 6,600 of the roughly 12,500 were casualties just in that one action. And of the brigade and regimental commanders in Pickett's division, 13 out of the 15 were casualties. That gives you a sense of what was lost. Here are the casualty figures. Like most battles in the Civil War, you can check a variety of different sources and they'll be all over the map. You see 46,286 is the total. Most people would tell you that this figure right here, which I got from some official records by the regiment, was well below the mark for the Confederates. And I've got to believe, just simply because of Pickett's charge and that they were on the offensive most of the time, that the other estimates that it was nearer to 28,000 is probably correct. So you're going to hear anything from 51 to 53,000 overall casualties for this one campaign. There might be good reasons why the Confederates wanted to minimize their loss. Here is one of the quotes that you had from Lee as he reports in his casualties.
It is believed that the enemy suffered severely in these operations, but our own loss has not been light. General Barksdale is killed. Generals Garnett and Armistead are missing as prisoners. Generals Pender and Trimble are wounded in the leg, General Hood in the arm, and General Heth slightly in the head. General Kemper, it is feared, is mortally wounded. Our losses embrace many other valuable officers and men. General Wade Hampton was severely wounded in a different action in which the cavalry was engaged yesterday.
Okay. I'm not going to spend too much time in here. I think what I'd like to do now is to show what we've got here for at least my assessment of the strengths and the weaknesses of the two main leaders, Meade on the Union side and Lee on the Confederate side. And unusual in the case of Lee, lots of things to discuss about. But what questions do I have?